Welcome to Virtual Sentiments. I'm your host, Kristen Collins. On today's episode, I talked to Dr. Roos Slegers, a professor at Tilburg University in the Netherlands, whose work engages philosophy, literature, and economics. Roos and I share a lot of research interests like Adam Smith and 18th century political thought, modern social theory, and today's most pressing debates about digital technology. We ground our conversation in the notion of the uncanny valley. You may have heard or even used this concept in discussions about robotics and artificial intelligence to refer to a sense of something, usually a technology, meant to imitate a human being or human capacities, as just being slightly off in a peculiar and unnerving manner. The concept was originally coined by Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori, who unfortunately passed away just last month, January 2025, to describe why people would tend to be less comfortable with robotic prosthetics that tried to mimic human limbs too closely, but not closely enough. As this podcast is all about looking at contemporary topics with an eye to the past, we compare Mori's concept to Sigmund Freud's famous 1919 essay, The Uncanny. The father of modern psychoanalysis, Freud traced the notion of the uncanny through German etymology, through the ETA Hoffmann short story, The Sandman, from Tales of Hoffmann, which is a story of a young man with an excessively romantic sensibility falling in love with a female automaton, and finally, Freud's own psychoanalytic theories about sexuality. Roos helps us take a more critical reading of what Freud misses about Hoffmann's Sandman. And then we connect these discussions about 19th century romanticism and fears about modern technology with feminist scholar Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which helps us rethink the uncanny less as something to fear and maybe as a source of liberation and pleasure, providing us the grounds for transgressing boundaries and overly simplistic binary thinking. And then we show what all this has to do with contemporary debates about sci-fi, chatbots, and even transhumanism, especially recent efforts and investments in attempting to transcend our physical limits or bodily mortality. Roos does a fantastic job summarizing and synthesizing a lot of difficult material. So even if you aren't familiar with some of these ideas and authors already, please don't be too afraid. I think this will give you a lot to think about and maybe even some ideas for essays to read and movies to watch. I know that I came away from our conversation with a lot of different movies and books to dig into. Thanks so much for talking to us today, Roos.
Thank you very much, Kristen. It's wonderful to be here.
Great. Okay. So I am so excited. I think there's so much that we can talk about. The first thing just to frame the conversation for our audience, for our listeners, is the notion of the uncanny is something that I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with, especially in conversations about technology. But it has like a longer intellectual history to it that is kind of transcends the contemporary moment. And so we'll kind of go back and forth between today and the past, I think. So would you mind kind of giving us your kind of perspective on the way that people usually use the term uncanny, the idea of the uncanny valley today?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. So I think when people refer to the uncanny today, especially in relation to new digital developments, they are directly or indirectly referring to the uncanny valley, which is this concept that this a roboticist, Masahiro Mori, came up with and wrote about in 1970. So this is already a long time ago. He was actually writing about robotics and then specifically prostheses. So the idea that, okay, you had to amputate your arm, you want a new arm, rather than aiming for a very naturalistic, like a very human looking arm, it'd be much better to put on like just a real robot arm or even a wooden arm, something that doesn't look human at all, because people are going to be creeped out in a very particular way when they shake your hand, expecting a real hand, but then feeling that it is like plastic or whatever your fake hand might be made of. And he says, in these instances, you or your arm or you as a whole person might slide into the uncanny valley. And he's referring to this graph he drew up where he indicates that, well, the closer something looks like a human being, like the more it looks like a human being, familiarity, as he calls it, like increases up to a certain point, because if when it gets too close but is ever so slightly off, like it would be in the case of, say, this arm, it's actually going to have the exact opposite effect. It's not going to make you look more whole. It's actually going to make you look uncanny, sort of off in this very particular way.
Great. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the way the graph is drawn, it looks like a valley. There's this kind of steep drop. And then as you kind of continue and it's like still further away from familiarity, might still, though, increase in sort of becoming less uncanny and more comfortable.
Yeah. And he writes about it with like, if you have like Wall-E, right? Like the adorable robot from the Pixar movie, which is like very human-like, but, in its expressions, but of course doesn't look human at all. It's very cute to us. That's like the exact opposite of the sort of like Terminator, looks a lot like human, but is like off and then turns out to, be out to kill you. And so it's become very much a trope. Yeah. But like you said, it has a longer history, right? And we probably want to eventually get back to all the way to Freud.
Yeah, so we're going to get back. Yes, exactly. So I am so excited to talk about Freud because one of those thinkers that when you study political theory, maybe take a survey course in 20th century thought or social theory, or also psychoanalytic kind of methods in theory too, Freud is so central. But then if somebody like me, I don't really work on Freud or in psychoanalytic interpretive methods. And so I'm like, oh, it's just so fun whenever I get to go back. He's such a type of guy, so we can kind of get into I don't know if we want to say like a Freudian analysis of Freud, but kind of a whole holistic overview of Freud, in addition to, though, like, let's start with just his essay on the uncanny. And I wonder if you could kind of give us a little bit. Let's just start us off with like a little bit of introduction to what this essay is about.
Yes. So it's a very strange, very, very strange text. I mean, many of Freud's texts are a bit peculiar, especially if we're reading them now. But this essay, even by his own admission, is extremely convoluted. It is full of examples, full of sort of shifting definition. In a way, it's kind of a performance of the uncanny almost. It is on a subject that he claims he is not interested in or sensitive to, like, at all. Yet he's writing about it. And he might, like he indicates in the first few paragraphs, well, I actually might be very ill-suited to write this because I never experienced this, even though most of you people do. So, and then he sets off on these sort of two parallel tracks. He says, well, I want to figure out what this peculiar feeling is. It's within the field of aesthetics. It has something to do with dread. It's a particular form of dread. And first I'm going to take this dictionary definition approach, and he goes through all these different languages. And, of course, German is the only language which has a proper word even for this feeling, which is significant in and of itself. And then he just goes through all these examples, fictional examples from patients, his own experiences, even though he just claimed not to be, sensitive to the uncanny at all. And what it comes down to, and this is perhaps most relevant to say by means of introduction, is that, we're talking about the uncanny, the German term here that, the uncanny translates, as we already know, imperfectly, because only German, speaks truth here.
Yeah.
Das Unheimliche, which I guess the more literal translation would be the unhomely. So the uncanny has something to do with the home, the most familiar, the place you feel most at ease, becoming frightening in some way. So it's the familiar becoming unfamiliar in a particular way, and he wants to figure out how that works and if there's some kind of universal, like example we can land on or description that works for everybody. Turns out we can't, and he just spends the whole essay chasing this and kind of undermining and convoluting things. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, like you said, so we can kind of go into the different ways that he starts off with the language. And I'm not even going to attempt the German because I just don't know German. So we'll rely on you for that. But it is really striking. So it is this idea of this term, kind of the definitions of canny is what I'll say, or a Heimlich or homely. Have so he starts off saying how like there's multiple definitions of that, and even within that concept has what appears to be a kind of contradictory definition. As I was wondering if you could kind of speak on that, and sort of the way that even within that what we should think of as the opposite of uncanny has maybe this kind of duality to it, I guess is the best way to put it.
Yeah. It's a fascinating a little description that he gives like a little linguistic background. So this works much better for Germanic or for German speakers, or also for Dutch speakers like I am. We have this double sense of the word homely, so heimlich in German, where like you point out, Freud says heimlich and its opposite unheimlich. The word kind of changes into its opposite depending on your perspective. And what he means by that is to say that, well, I'm inside my home now, and so I am comfortable, right? Like within my home. I mean, hopefully, and I am right now. But to somebody on the outside, I am secreted away, right? I am actually out of sight. So I am heimlich, homely, from within the home, feeling at ease in my home. That is a familiar, place of rest and peace, etc. But from a different perspective, I am actually hidden. And so Freud points out that the feeling of Unheimlichkeit, so unhomeliness, uncanniness, has something to do with that shift, a shift that's present within the word itself, but that can actually translate to our experience of one of the dictionary. He quotes many different dictionaries, and he says, okay, there's a heimlich stream, like a homely stream. So, and he's referring to like a hidden spring where you're walking over land, but in fact there's a spring running underneath, which is again like secreted away. It's there's something hidden about it. What is hidden in this, and the fact that it is hidden, that can become, in the kind of cases that he talks about, a source of dread, because we thought we knew what we were dealing with, but in fact something is hidden in there and comes out when it shouldn't.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. There's this interesting, weird kind of normative valence to it of unheimlich. Yeah. So I learned French and Russian, so that's like the only, and I will say neither of those really good.
He doesn't like only Russian, unfortunately, but yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, but unheimlich, this idea of a sort of something that should be hidden being revealed in some way, which I think will be interesting when we get to kind of the psychoanalytic resources that or examples, cases that he tries to use to kind of explore the concept. Well, actually, let's just go ahead and do that. When we're talking Freud, maybe actually before we get into kind of the different cases that he used to sort of explore what this notion is, what evokes it. Like you said, he starts off with this very interesting, it's a feeling that I don't really experience that much. And so I might not be the best person to talk about. And I don't know, I was just reviewing Civilization and its Discontents, which is another part of his work. And he does a similar thing in the beginning of that as well, with the notion of oceanic feeling, where he's saying, this is something I don't really experience. So I wonder if you could help contextualize for listeners who might not be familiar with Freud a little bit about, okay, he's a psychoanalyst, he's saying he's a scientist, but he's talking about all these, I mean, I think it seems like a highly unscientific enterprise to try to figure out what exactly we're doing with the feeling of uncanny. So if you could just kind of review for us, situate us a little bit more about who is this guy and why should we care what he has to say?
Yeah. Right. Oh, well, that is a very big question. I mean, maybe to keep it very very close to the text. I mean, obviously, right, like you point out, like in his other works too, there's a lot of things I think we now look at. And one of the very prominent features of this text is castration, right, which keeps coming up. And I think people who have sort of a cursory familiarity with Freud will know about his castration complex and penis envy and all those things that I think, we could have some serious, people do have some serious doubts about how well that actually captures the human experience. But to keep it very close to this text and what we were just talking about in the Uncanny, something that I do think speaks to the imagination or might make it a bit more compelling as to why should we read this text, because it maybe sounds just straight up bonkers as we are talking about it now, is that he talks about all these things that we might have repressed. Obviously, it's become a word it's very, much used in a common language, right? Things we have repressed or but never, he says, fully surmounted, so that there are old beliefs that sort of lie in wait for evidence, and that then will leap at this evidence for sort of confirmation. So he and this is where we'll eventually probably get into the many examples that he goes through. He says, well, for children, it is not at all creepy to imagine their dolls coming to life. In fact, this would be a rather joyous occasion. I mean, they're pretending that they're alive, and if the dolls would come, I mean, up to a certain age, obviously, children would be quite delighted to then play with them. But we as grown-ups, right, are supposed to have, pass through that sort of animistic stage where we inspire everything with life. And the Chucky movies, I don't know if that means anything to you. Just the terrifying murder doll movies where the doll does in fact come to life and starts murdering people with a kitchen knife. Like, that works well because it plays on those childhood fantasies that actually have become fears because we have repressed it, but it's not quite gone out of our system, right? It's sort of lying in wait. It's merely been repressed. And then a horror movie will trigger us, right, on exactly those, primitive, and I'm using quotation marks here, primitive beliefs, whether these come from our own childhood or they are like beliefs that used to be common among, like Freud, very casually talks about primitive people all the time, right? Like earlier stages when humankind actually did live in like an animistic world, where the belief was that, okay, everything is in fact animated. So when strange things happen, we are not really going to be creeped out by it because we can just ascribe it to the spirits or demons or whatever it is being at work. However, we, considering ourselves rational people now, we cannot let ourselves believe those things anymore. And so as a result, when something happens that, sure seems too much of a coincidence, right, to be just that, just a coincidence, greater forces must be at work here. And those old beliefs are kind of come back with a vengeance because they have been repressed. And so this text very much plays into that idea that, of repression, of what happens when we haven't fully surmounted, is, I think, usually the English translation used, those primitive childhood beliefs, obsessions, etc.
Yeah, great. No, that's excellent. And so it is this mix of beliefs that we think of more kind of socially, or a historian might talk about in terms of kind of religious spirituality and like the way that sort of these unseen forces throughout the world, but then also a sort of psychoanalysis of childhood and of childhood kind of beliefs and experiences, and that kind of shaping through. Coming through and kind of explaining kind of these dynamics as well. Yeah. So then why don't we dive in a little bit more to some of the different examples? Because I think what's interesting about the uncanny and what strikes me when I'm reading Freud is that it seems like it's something that should be socially constituted to some degree. Insofar as there might be different types of, he talks a lot about kind of the uncanny feeling and how it is provoked in reality versus how it is provoked in storytelling or fiction, like when we're reading. And so what is striking to me, in kind of both cases, there might be things that we might be unused to, or but then it becomes kind of a trope or a genre. And so what maybe, at least for an individual, like if I've read a lot of Gothic literature, for example, it might start off very uncanny, but then, at some point there are some things that I see so often that's just, oh, this is genre now. Like this is just this sort of world building that all the authors are kind of negotiating and working within. And when they subvert it or when they add something new, that's when I might have this feeling of uncanny. So I guess I was wondering if you can kind of walk us through either kind of the sort of storytelling version of the uncanny, and also I guess maybe push back on Freud a little bit of like how much of this is something that kind of is socially constituted, or at least affected by kind of personal experience too.
Yes, absolutely. So perhaps picking up on something, we talked about just now about Freud being impervious to this, supposedly. There's actually some really interesting like Easter eggs in the text that I think can help us sort of, get into your question. And so Freud, he mentions many different instances of the uncanny, every time saying like, okay, there's no universal example that's going to work for everybody. We might say, you're mentioning these gothic tales, horror movies, depending on the kind of horror we're talking about here, not the sort of very chainsaw splashery kind, but the kind, that's where the movie starts out with everything is normal, except for, immediately that something is terribly wrong, right? Hitchcock's The Birds. In the beginning, there's children singing. There's a woman smoking a cigarette. There's just a few crows landing on the playground. Nothing is wrong. Everything looks familiar, but there is that dread lurking in the familiar. So you're sort of like, and like you mentioned, this is genre. You're being set up, and yet it's this is a very old movie, but for many people it is effective. Freud himself, and this is one of these Easter eggs that I think is in the text. He says, repetition can have an uncanny effect. So, for example, say that you board a train and you are assigned seat number 62. And then you head to the address you need to be that day, right? And it is, the house number is 62. And then later you're handed a stub for your coat at the coat check at the theater, and it's 62. And the number 62 occurs, I don't know, like how many times does it need to occur in what succession, right, for you to feel, wait a second, there's a significance to this number 62. Perhaps I will die at age 62. Now, if you look at Freud's age when he wrote The Uncanny, he was 61. So it's kind of like, well, Freud, like impervious to the uncanny. So that's that. But so with the storytelling, like what exact sort of method of the uncanny they pick up on? Freud says a big one is repetition, right? Like, so where the isolated event of the bird landing on the playground, no. But if a bird lands again and again and again, and the number is repeated. So a doubling, a repetition, he says that's not all uncanny is a doubling, but the phenomenon of the double, the doppelganger, right? Like I suddenly see somebody who looks an awful lot like me. Oscar Wilde, right? The picture of Dorian Gray, like the double, right, reflects the murderous intentions of the original. We are now doubling ourselves in our digital lives constantly. So, your question was about storytelling and sort of how to set it up. Freud keeps referring to these different tropes that are used, dismissing them, sort of adding new ones, saying like, okay, the double is a big thing, but maybe also we need to consider, you saw this in the text, right? Like what he refers to this other researcher, Jensch, who says, well, it's really always stories about whether something is alive or not, right? Animate or inanimate. So he doesn't really give us sort of a single sort of genre trope, but kind of keeps adding these different examples, trying to get us along, hoping that at some point we'll be like, yes, I've had like that, I understand that, I recognize. For me, this approach is actually quite effective in the text because many things in them just like whatever, but there's a few of them there where as a reader, I'm like, yes, that feeling I do know. And that's, I think, his sort of rhetorical strategy here in the text.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And so I sort of like, I think there's at some point where he sort of lists out the factors that turn something fearful into an uncanny thing. And it's like animism, magic and witchcraft, omnipotence of thoughts, man's attitude to death, involuntary repetition, and the castration complex. So my understanding is that, so one of the other cases that he talks about is in the storytelling mode or the storytelling type of uncanny is the Sandman. Would you be willing to kind of walk us through a little bit about how he uses that? Because I'm not super familiar with the text. And this is from Tales of Hoffmann, I believe.
Yes. Oh, this is such a great story. I mean, if I can like make like one recommendation, the Freud essay is great, but honestly, I like this story better.
Great. Okay, great. Yeah, I'll read it next.
It's central to Freud's text. He gives us a very biased sort of retelling within the essay. It's really worth reading the story also because, I mean, you mentioned sort of Gothic. This is German Gothic, or it's like, an early, like, it's a German romantic text that is very satirical, that doesn't come through in Freud's retelling of it at all. It's actually very, very funny, and it contains this. I think it's like 1816 that it first came out, and it has this social critique. It has a robot. It has a very stereotypical heterosexual love. It has like so much more than the uncanny, and it has the title, the Sandman, like this spectral figure of dread who haunts like the main sort of the protagonists dreams and reality, question mark. Like, we're kind of unclear as to whether this is a real person, if it's just a figment of his imagination. But the story actually opens on 3 letters, and the narrator, after those 3 letters, steps in saying, like, look, I really didn't know how to begin this story, so I decided not to begin at all, but just give you the letters between Nathaniel and Lothar, his friend, who's also the brother of Nathaniel's fiancée, Clara, whose name Clara, clarity, like, she's sort of the rational enlightenment spirit in all of this. It's like, poking through the romantic nonsense of Nathaniel. And the narrator, right, stepping in after those 3 letters, says, like, look, I could say that people have been begging me to tell you this story. This is really not true. I just feel like you should know. So there's a very interesting, like, the narrator is kind of a very interesting, very present character in the story as well. But essentially in the letters, Nathaniel describes to his friend Lothar how, Nathaniel's a student, and he just met somebody that really reminds him of a figure that really frightened him when he was a boy, and that he has come to call the Sandman. This was a friend of Nathaniel's father who would come to dinner, and the children would dread this person because he was just kind of disgusting looking, and he would touch the children's food, so they no longer wanted to eat it. And after dinner, this person would go with Nathaniel's father to this sort of study, but it turns out to be kind of a place where they did alchemical experiments. And one night, Nathaniel has hidden himself away in this room to see what's going on. And he believes that when he's very scared at a certain point, and he believes that then he is like dragged out of his hiding place, thrown into the fire, and that this person tries to steal his eyes, and he, faints and wakes up weeks later from like a nervous fit or not, whatever it might be. And so he thinks he has now met this person again in a different disguise, and he now feels haunted by this person. This letter, it was meant for his friend, but he accidentally sends it to his fiancée, Clara, who then responds like, oh, I'm kind of troubled by this, but trust me, this is just a figment of your imagination. She's just very reasonable. This is not a real presence in the world. It's all in your head. He's very upset with her being so sensible. He craves like his childlike fiance. Is like, oh, she's so pretty, and normally she would just be quiet, but now she feels the need to philosophize. Like, who has taught her this? In any case, where the story starts to really interest Freud, and where I think it doesn't just become interesting here. I think what precedes it is also interesting because it kind of sets up this weird dynamic between Nathaniel and his fiance. Is where Nathaniel, back in his student town, falls in love with this very elegant figure, Olympia, the daughter of one of his professors. He completely forgets about his fiance. There's a ball. He dances with her. He's very surprised nobody else wants to dance with her. Other people are all kind of uncomfortable, all kind of like laughing because she sings like very shrilly but perfectly in tune. She dances very we start to figure it out. This is an automaton, of course, right? But she is also the perfect woman because whenever he reads his poetry, unlike other ladies who will like insist on like petting their cat or, knitting or yawning, but she just stares into his eyes lovingly. And he gets the sense she really gets me. She really understands. But throughout the text, the only thing she ever says is, ah. so it's this, it's early 19th century perfect encapsulation of like, the decorative woman who's perfect because she's
made to be seen and not heard.
Yeah, exactly. Just to be projected on. And yeah, so in any case, like, he eventually finds out that she is a doll, has another fit of madness. It's like a very complicated plot that I won't like totally give away all the way in the end, but we are as readers unclear as to whether the Sandman figure actually is haunting him, whether it is all in his head. He constantly keeps going back to Clara, but then, resorts to his romantic madness when Clara doesn't want to listen to his poetry that his other lover indulged so beautifully. And so Freud wraps all of this up by saying, clearly the figure, he just completely sidelines Olympia, right, the automaton love interest, to say that clearly what makes the story uncanny is the figure of the Sandman, who threatens to take out Nathaniel's eyes, which obviously stands for castration, right? To deprive a man of his eyes, just like Oedipus, take out the eyes, essentially is like a mitigated form of castration, and off we go. Therefore, right, uncanniness is connected to the castration complex.
Yeah, no, great. That's a really, and it is. So then I want to kind of dig into kind of the automaton aspect of the story a little bit, because it's interesting that Freud kind of does sideline, but you were saying, so sort of what's not in Freud's interpretation in terms of this being a satirical work. Would you mind kind of giving us a little more of a window into that, into these other interpretations of the same story?
So first of all, it's I think a pretty funny critique of the romantic soul, right? Nathaniel very clearly is fancies himself a poet, and all his poetry is very dark and mystical, and everybody who doesn't understand, he calls them prosaic, and just these bland minds who have no everybody who has a rational explanation for what's happening to him, he dismisses because it needs to be all very deep. He insists on there being greater forces at work. And everybody who dismisses that, especially when his fiance doesn't want to listen to any of it or just won't have it, he just gets very mad with. And so the descriptions of Nathaniel, right, kind of skewer that overly romantic sensibility. In addition to that, once it's found out that society has been hoodwinked by this professor who presented them with his daughter, who then turned out to be an automaton, lovers expect expect their beloveds to dance slightly out of step, to never sneeze, because sneezing might be sort of hiding the winding up of the mechanism that keeps them going. And people need to sing slightly out of tune. Everybody is now trying to prove that they're not an automaton. And so there's all these new sort of societal conventions that actually bring people closer together, because rather than aiming for perfection, that imperfection is now the goal. And so it's an interesting kind of very ironic take in itself. I think what makes it also really interesting to us is now the whole conversation about all sorts of personal assistants and ChatGPT and et cetera, but not just that, but all the AI-infused sex dolls that are on the market, right? that are supposed to mimic life, but if they do it too perfectly, and this brings us back to the uncanny valley too, right? It actually can be rather off-putting. So if you kind of, Freud dismisses Olympia, but if you take Olympia seriously, or if you give her kind of center stage, it actually allows us, I think, to come up with some fun perspectives or ways to frame this obsession also in movies, right? Ex Machina, Her, etc. It's all been very much in the news again. They're all kind of forms of Olympia, right? And this is more than 200 years ago, and I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I mean, I don't know because I don't want to go too far back to in the historical moment, although that is part of the podcast and everything. But I also, there's knowing us, we could probably go down a lot of routes and might not be as accessible to the audience. But it is really striking to me, this kind of duality of the piece in terms of it kind of skewering romanticism to some degree, only insofar as, he's sort of it's almost like in a romantic posture that the characters Nathaniel seems to kind of embody. But it just reminds me a lot about Jean-Jacques Rousseau and this sort of duality of the romantic, privileging and celebration of nature and authenticity, and the natural is authentic, and a suspicion of the social and the artificial, while at the same time Rousseau's writing on women is so much more. He talks about how women. He talks about girls always wanting to kind of attention and being interested in like the sort of natural vanity. And actually, I really like, so I cite this in my work, that Bentham has this little dig at Rousseau and his letters in the Panopticon, where it's too much to kind of go into that, but he talks about how, like Rousseau doesn't want men to become automata, but he'd be perfectly fine with women being like that, that sort of thing. Yeah. So I guess this sort of interesting, like, sexuality and gender being a part of it, of this strange, like, retrieval of the natural and this kind of fearful of the artificial, but then also this sort of putting all of that burden onto women and kind of, and having kind of this on the one hand, like, I think, and we can get into Freud, women kind of being identified with the natural, but then at the same time, insofar as women like makeup, like to perform, like are in the theater and all of that, they are kind of what is all sick and wrong with like modern society, with like new society, with the Enlightenment and progress in that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's a really interesting backdrop against which to consider this story of Olympia, who of course is all artifice and is imbued with life. I mean, there's several instances in the story where Nathaniel touches Olympia's hand and is at first horrified because it's ice cold. I mean, talk about the uncanny valley, right? The Mori hand described there. But then his own love, right, and passion sort of animates her hand. And the same when he kisses her, her lips are of course cold, and then it's only and he sort of recoils, but then he realizes this is the love of a higher being, and the same with her. She has these dead eyes, right? So like just everybody is kind of put off by them, but he sees like they're just gazing on a different dimension, and so it's she is there to, of course, reflect him, and he's madly in love, well, with himself, obviously, right? Like through her, but all because she is pure artifice. So the ideal woman is there's nothing real about her.
Yeah. And so there is a sense with the uncanny too, that there's this strange, that back to the definition that it's sort of like Freud wants to say is not enough, but is also part of it, which is this inanimate to animate duality. And so there's this like struggle with, I think, people trying to negotiate, like, is this entity, is this something that like I can project, that I can control, or that like is for me, or is it something separate and alive? And kind of when that becomes that ambiguity becomes like part of the uncanny.
Absolutely. And to take that a step further, perhaps, it gets even weirder when we start having those doubts about ourselves, or so we can become uncanny to ourselves in a number of ways. And you like in the essay, he talks about how when you see somebody having an epileptic seizure, right, and suddenly they move in a way that human beings normally do not move, right? There's a jerkiness to those movements that, of course, like you said earlier, if you're used to it, if you're a doctor dealing with this on the regular, there's nothing uncanny, this is everyday practice to you, right? So again, very subjective to most of us who don't deal with this, especially if a loved one, say, falls to the floor and starts seizing. You've never seen this before. I've had that experience, and it's like, so it quite apart from, of course, the immediate concern and worry you feel, there's something becomes visible, right? It's the unfamiliar and the familiar that we suspect, okay, this was there all along. These bodily functions, the way that the fact that the body can move this way, this was always there, but it was hidden, and it should have stayed hidden. And now it's on the surface, and rather than having a person we can talk to, they're now seizing on the floor. And this is not like, this gives us that particular sense of dread. Now, of course, we wouldn't be around to see ourselves in a seizure, but when when particular ailments, right, or like cancer, or like where the most familiar thing, our home, right, becomes unhomely because it turns out our cells are multiplying, and so there's all these ways in which the familiar can become unfamiliar in this the hidden can manifest and sort of make us, well, wait a second, we never paused to think of it, and now it's here, and was it there all along? And now what else can we trust anything? How can we go through life feeling secure?
Well, and so I think it's worth kind of acknowledging the sort of, it's funny because Freud says I'm gonna start this essay with the dictionary definitions and I'm gonna give some like examples. But it's interesting because he says, well, actually, when I was working on this and trying to figure this out, I started with the examples and then like I verified my like findings using the dictionary, which is kind of funny. And so by the end of the piece, he finally works up to what I think is really, and for Freud, psychoanalyst, it's not so surprising. He's talking about female genitalia as what his patients are often describing as uncanny. And it is this idea of, this is everybody's home. Everybody comes from the womb. But then, when they become older, when they actually see a woman's genitalia, that's uncanny to them. It's this strange kind of foreignness, which I think kind of gets to this like, and you can, I'm interested in your thoughts on that section. But I think what it makes me think a lot about is, and I think this is sort of a Freudian idea too, or influenced by Freud, which is this idea of like, I think people want just total communion with each other. I think that they want to feel, I think that that's the appeal to some degree in the story you're talking about with Nathaniel and his love for this automaton is this projection. And what that means is that like, she is everything that he needs her to be. And that there is nothing kind of mysterious in the sense of like, there's no inner life of this woman that he needs to kind of deal with. Getting back to kind of what you started with this idea of he doesn't like that his fiance suddenly, is being sensible, is kind of trying to get him to kind of question these beliefs he has. And so there's something where, we desire this total oneness with each other, but we just can't give that to each other because of our kind of separate various aspects of just who we are kind of, I can't literally feel your feelings, but also like, that is part of the beauty of being, we are both like socially created beings. We are intersubjectively related to each other and how we see the world, but then also like we have our own kind of way of being in the world and orienting ourselves too. And we're kind of always fighting this kind of social versus kind of intimate kind of individual experience too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree with your reading here, and you that it's a very funny section, I think, in Freud's text because it is that, doesn't he refer to the German saying that love is homesickness or something like that?
Yes, he does.
Which,
yeah.
Of course, it's always a very male, like hetero male perspective. Talking about the womb as, of course, the original home, and how we want to be back there in a way, except for, right, like previously we talked about the etymology there of like Heimlich, what like you were once in the home, now you're outside of it, and hence it has become what was once your Heim has now become unheimlich because you're on the outside, and so female genitalia, as he puts it, right, are uncanny for that reason. Again, the perspective is always, obviously, of a straight male interested to get back in there, and yet also scared. And of course, I mean, you're familiar with the whole vagina dentata trope. I've already made reference to several horror movies, but it shows up everywhere, right? Like some monster where that, whether it's the sandworms in Dune or Alien in the Alien movies. Like,
I was thinking Alien is the...
Yeah. It's a classic of like, it might swallow you back up and then, like there's real trouble. So as like the most frightful, what you most long for also becomes the most haunting kind of thing. And so that tension between the deepest desire and then also,
a fear
becomes our deepest fear, essentially, is of course a classic move.
Yeah, no, exactly. Which I think also, so to sort of subvert kind of Freud's very particular perspective there, I think it's worth kind of putting this in conversation, if we can, a little bit with Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, because I think what we're getting at with like the romanticism and the sort of nature versus technology, and then also this sort of Freudian, the uncanniness kind of being identified with the womb or female genitalia. It's also, I think, what Donna Haraway is doing in her work, and using the notion of the cyborg to kind of subvert and transcend and complicate the dualisms that we've been talking about and that we're kind of seeing in Freud. And I actually, to sort of the conclusion that she draws that I really like, and we don't have to stick to the text, just like thinking like, what does this idea of the cyborg mean to us too? But she says towards the end, cyborg imagery can suggest a way out of the maze of dualisms in which we have explained our bodies and our tools to ourselves. This is a dream not of a common language, but of a powerful infidel heteroglossia. I really love that line. It's a little, it verges on being a little bit hard to understand, but I think it gets us to something really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think verges on hard to understand is a very euphemistic way of describing this text, which is can feel to me very obscure in patches, but it is fantastic, I think, to reread now, and I'm really glad that you want to bring it into conversation with this with Freud's Uncanny. So maybe it's helpful to, you mentioned Rousseau earlier, and this notion of original purity and wholeness, and kind of and this again nostalgic, right, talked about a different homecoming in Freud with the womb, but this idea of like the desire to return to a time when things were like pure and innocent, and that this is then particularly, of course, put on women, like, and you should be that, right? And when I come home to you, what I expect is innocence and purity, right? And then heterosexual frolicking, obviously. But and in its natural state, or whatever it might be. And so what I really like about Haraway is that she positions the figure of the cyborg completely in opposition to that, like not as a new duality, but more to say like the cyborg has no truck with gender, has no interest in these binary distinctions, is not interested in innocence. It's an ironic, playful, hybrid creature that's much more interested in affinity and kinship than in identity. So it's all about boundary blurring and boundary crossing and transgression and all of that in a very playful mode. Now, I think where like what Haraway describes, she doesn't quite manage to perform in her text, because it is a very heavy-handed text. I think in most parts there's some exceptions, but she refers to a lot of other stories, especially science fiction, right, as kind of the new genre or the new playing field. She says science fiction has become fact. And I mean, she writes this again decades ago too, right? But this, we need to also recognize that science fiction is now factoring into our reality to the extent where they're no longer distinguishable. And we are already cyborgs. We are already these non-innocent, boundary crossing, ambiguous figures. We just need to embrace it, essentially. And so that's a completely different, a completely different figure, a completely different attitude also that she proposes from, you mentioned Rousseau, but then by extension also this, the female as the natural, original home, etc.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, there's something very, and it's like the dualities that we're talking about here are sort of the dualities, both like of gender, of like the sort of male, female, but also machine, organism, so the nature, the artifice. There's like a few different things that we're talking about. And what I think is interesting is that it's like what I read her as doing is that she wants to kind of play with and transgress boundaries, but not try to destroy them, not totally, not to deny the existence of some boundaries, or I mean, it sort of depends. It's I don't want to overstate that too much, but it's sort of like, I think so much of technology is decried on like a very kind of basic sense of it kind of being intermediary, like it's sort of separating us from each other, from ourselves, or having some sort of like kind of yeah, this is sort of like interventionary kind of existence, but that in reality, it is something that's actually much more complicated and more interwoven into our existence to some degree too. Or what the cyborg is a being who is part machine, part organism, and therefore you can't really fit them into one box or the other. But there is still kind of it's a networked. That's some of the language she uses is this sort of networked way of thinking about things rather than the duality way of thinking about things.
Yes, exactly. And I think you're absolutely right to say that it's not that she wants to do away with boundaries, because then you can't cross them anymore, right? And where's the fun in that? And she very much pushes back against the idea of some sort of totalizing like theory or worldview that would bring everything under one umbrella and explain everything. Like she says, that's always that, she has a lot of comments also on the sort of feminism and feminisms of her time. Like she's one of like an as a very early white feminist to recognize that, wait a second, we're really privileging the perspective of white women here. And also, how do we define women, right? Like as in opposition to men. And so she wants to move beyond all that. Like she might not be completely successful in the way she lays it out, but I think the intention that's there and this very novel idea of like, instead of, the good savage or something, like, no, the cyborg, right? And like you say, who's networked and who, and there, yes, there's difference and there should be all this difference. Like the worst thing is to totalize. And that's what she keeps pushing back against.
Yeah. No, that's exactly the right kind of term to use it. Let's go take a step back to the cyborg and to the uncanny. And because what I think is very striking is what I think like what Donna Haraway is trying to do with the cyborg, if we put this in conversation with Freud, it seems like, is the uncanny, it's two things. Like one, I mean, we can already do that without Donna Haraway, but when Freud talks about the womb as uncanny, I mean, it's highly, and he will say that it's his male patient saying it. And so it's like, it's a highly particularistic, or it can't be the case for everybody that's a good example of the uncanny. Right. And what I think Donna Haraway is also sort of, but what she adds to that is this idea of like, maybe the uncanny is a good thing. Maybe that's something that we can like embrace, and like, we got to lean into the uncanny.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that's actually exactly where I wanted to go with this. I'm so glad you're taking us there, because I think what in a way Haraway is describing is kind of the liberating potential of the uncanny. Yeah. That where Freud, it remains a subset of dread, right? It is a feeling of dread. Like, of course, what he is describing in many ways is like, okay, something that is very familiar but is ever so slightly off. Well, that's a very good description also for, say, like racism, right? Like for a racist reaction. It's like, well, this person is kind of like me, except for not, and so it freaks me out. So for a transgender person, or right, like, a lot of the narrative around that, or the sort of suspicions and the bias, it can sort of be captured. I mean, obviously, Freud doesn't use these as examples, but you could see how they could like fit pretty well within that text. And what Haraway is, of course, interested in, right? Cyborg, short for cybernetic organism, though she widens it to include not just cybernetic the components, but any sort of right technology or non-organic matter. So that too, I'm wearing contact lenses, like even that is like cyborgian, right? But my reliance on my phone, etc. But by extension, right, as you mentioned before, it's like, it's not like there are no boundaries. It's just that the cyborg takes pleasure in crossing them. And I think that very significantly, there is no pleasure in Freud's text, right? I mean,
yeah.
It's funny kind of despite itself sometimes. And but it's not ironic. It's not playful. It's not exactly these things that to Haraway are central to her notion of the cyborg, who of course would be like this very unsettling creature, right? Like from this Freudian perspective that we've just been describing, except for Haraway, it is like a necessary step towards our liberation. And so I think you're absolutely right to say that, well, right, the uncanny for good. That doesn't make it any less difficult, though, because bringing the two together, I think, can help us also underscore how difficult it is to sort of confront the unfamiliar in the familiar, and rather than sort of try to immediately repress that, like get it away to rather sort of sit with it, right? And like it's always hard to sit with ambiguity or to and it, reading Haraway in this way, I think gets us towards sort of an interesting reinterpretation of that Freudian text too.
Yeah, no, exactly. And it's getting back to this sort of storytelling element and the science fiction as genre. And that's what's so interesting is like I think the Sandman. I don't know if I mean I'm thinking also we've had Eileen Hunt on here and she'll talk about Frankenstein, Mary Shelley as sort of like early science fiction, and so. I'd be interested both on your thoughts on science fiction more broadly, but it's okay if you want to kind of add to what you were saying about Donna Haraway on science fiction too, and it becoming kind of a part of our lives. And also, and that's what was a striking part of her text that I actually struggled with, and I'm still trying to work through. She says how the pleasure we derive in reading science fiction isn't about identification, and so it's not like I identifying, but I kind of struggled with that. So I guess more on what are we doing when we read science fiction, and how does it kind of orient ourselves around these questions?
Yes. So it's I struggle with that same part of the text because I just don't buy it really.
Yeah.
I like to be swept up in the narrative and so in science fiction, of course, it is. Increasingly, academics are taking science fiction seriously now that so much science fiction is becoming science fact, right? That's especially in the world of AI, and there seem to be all these prescient movies, her, of course, being the big example from last year, where Sam Altman, right, CEO of OpenAI, even made the connection explicitly between the science fiction movie from 10 years ago and the new ChatGPT iteration. But there's, Minority Report, like all these movies that seem to have foreshadowed actual scientific developments and inventions today. So this has been a reason, I think, for more people to sort of look at science fiction not just as entertainment, but also as literature or actual films that we might want to watch, for something else than just their entertainment value. Like that said, I think there's still, especially within certain circles, a strong bias towards this so-called hard sci-fi, right? So people harkening back to the golden age of science fiction with Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, like the Arthur C. Clarke, the sort of mid 20th century. Okay, let's do this thought experiment. Let's take seriously these scientific discoveries and kind of extrapolate. And so they become thought experiments, which again can be super fun and also very engaging. I personally am more into what is often somewhat derisively called like soft science fiction, right? So I'm thinking like Ursula Le Guin as an early instance of somebody working in that genre, where the central figure tends to be an anthropologist, right? Or some kind of social scientist, like taking in life on different planets. And there's also much more attention paid to the sort of political setup, right? Like the planets that are, just where anarchy rules, but that works actually really well, in opposition to like capitalist planets, etc. But sort of to bring us back to back on track and to your question, I think that within these science fiction narratives, actually, you are very much invited to identify, but kind of in these surprising ways where there's kind of a safe space you're entering, where in reality you might not be comfortable crossing these boundaries at all, like within the context of this movie or within the context of this book. I'm thinking, for example, there's this great 1995 anime, Ghost in the Shell.
Oh, I haven't seen that yet, actually. I've been wanting to see it.
There's a later Scarlett Johansson shows up in a lot of science fiction. There's a later version with Scarlett Johansson, like which is fine, but I think the
anime I've always heard is the way to go.
Well, it has an edginess and it's a really profound and really evocative a story that really questions, like, okay, bodies are owned by corporations, and you can swap out different parts, but then you're sort of owned by these corporations. And of course, the way I'm telling it seems kind of simplistic, but it's beautifully done in the movie, where then it also leads to these questions of loyalty and identity, and somebody can have the same body as you. And well, in any case, I think movies like that sort of give an interesting perspective on, again, like very real and very popular narratives now, like, for example, the transhumanist movement, right? Like that's so many big tech investors and CEOs that truly believe that the singularity is near and that we're going to be able to upload our consciousness. And this to them, this is going to happen, right? Like this is, and what I think is really interesting if we read Haraway, right? Again, now of course she wrote many things after this, but right, using this sort of as the central text here, I think she'd be extremely skeptical about this new, which again is sort of a return to wholeness, right? But in the future, in the future, we will be perfected. And there's so many interesting science fiction stories where you feel, right, all these like Elon Musk being of course a prime example, like they've said to that they were very inspired by, say, Asimov, etc., but they're kind of cherry picking from these narratives because usually these stories tell us that things go terribly wrong.
Yeah, they're very tragic and foreboding and a warning of sorts against like hubris and perfectionism to some degree.
Exactly. So when Haraway, in a very roundabout way, I'm trying to get back to your question, but when Haraway tells us to read science fiction, right, and how she kind of gives it center stage, it's not just sort of like, oh, here's this fun thought experiment, but also no, truly, science fiction is filtering into our everyday lives. And that's true now more than ever before, which is very exciting and, well, or troubling, depending on how you look at it, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think there's something but that's why what I love about it is it's a let's, I can't help but, I think it's sorry, there's this video game I play a lot called Baldur's Gate 3. I'm like very obsessed with it. I'm like totally addicted to it. That also has a lot about storytelling and like sort of, yeah, a lot there too. But there's this line, I think it's from that game, that's like sometimes the only way out or sometimes the only way over is through. And I guess it's also like maybe something people say, but I think, yeah. So with Haraway, it's like, let's not be fearful of technology and science, but like our only way to deal with these issues and also like to respond to people like who think that we can kind of perfect ourselves, return to wholeness, is to go into technology as well. Like there's no way of kind of putting the genie back in the bottle or that sort of thing. But also like this is exciting. Like there's a possibility of being excited and kind of questioning and subverting dualisms that no longer really serve us and that are oversimplifying. But then also at the same time, that doesn't mean that there aren't kind of new horrors that await us, but we have to kind of negotiate those with more nuance than just simply, wanting a return to nature or a return to some mystical past when that was so much better than now.
Yeah. Well, and to underscore what you're saying, I mean, she talks about how cyborgs are the offspring of these awful. Well, she mostly refers to fathers here, right? And she calls them cyborgs are bastard children, right? But and they're born of, like, sure, scientific discovery, but also militarism, imperialism, colonialism, right? All these new technologies came about to further warfare, and he only got to go to school, Haraway herself, right, and got to study because they were encouraging women to go into the academy in the absence of all the men who were fighting the war. So she is very aware of the kind of the parentage here, and so it's quite the opposite of sort of, okay, let's return to, it's like, no, but you can actually distance yourself from your parents, right? And your heritage, it doesn't condemn you to then continue in that same vein. In fact, like there's something very rebellious about the cyborg, which makes it so hard to capture, and why I think this text continues to sort of fascinate, but you can't quite employ it because it's too, very purposefully prickly and it has all these weird edges and angles. Yeah.
And it's something that she warns about in the beginning of it. And it's quite different from the Freud's essay on the uncanny in the sense of kind of the way that it's situating the reader and preparing the reader for what's ahead. And is a little bit like, yes, she's sort of framing it, oh, this is very playful, this is a little ironic, but it's also like, I want you to kind of totally go on this ride with me.
Yes.
And like,
Yeah.
I'm a part of it. Like, I'm fully in, like,
Yeah. No, she's dead serious. Yeah.
I'm a distant observer who, like, I don't actually know what any of this is like. I'm just
Yeah, it's very coy. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
and Haraway's all in, absolutely.
No, exactly. And I wanted to actually, you've been so generous with your time, but I wanted to kind of return to that notion of the movie Her, and also the parts of the story that we've been kind of talking about in terms of like projection. And so just kind of give us more. So we got Freud, we got Haraway. Would you mind, or if another movie would be better for you, kind of just showing us how Her kind of gets at some of the themes that we've been talking about here, in terms of both, and how that's kind of encapsulated, either kind of how it's encapsulating these concepts we've been talking about here, or like what you think, like if we watch that movie, how should that orient us to some of the contemporary debates that we're having today?
Right. So I always try to bend any conversation ultimately to the Terminator movies, and that's the turn I'm taking here, and then I'll get us back to Her.
No, Terminator also excellent, especially the second movie. I mean, I love both the first one and the second one, but that Terminator 2 I was like, oh my God, this is an incredible movie.
It's fantastic, right?
Anyway.
It is, I think, an amazing movie. Generally, I think people agree that the Terminator 2 is the best of the Terminator movies, and I completely agree. I do, however, want to briefly talk about Terminator 3. This is the one where Skynet does, in fact, take over, and I do think it is somewhat underappreciated, Terminator 3. It brings the story, of course, around to where it should be, because if Skynet doesn't, right, if the AI overlords don't take over, then how can you explain that all the time travel needs to happen? But without getting into the whole Terminator plot, the reason I bring it up is that, first of all, even if you haven't seen the Terminator movies, these have trickled into the popular subconscious, these movies, right? The fear of robots, and also the idea of the cyborg, and this is very un-Haraway, as extremely masculine, right? Like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator days, right? Like, well, I don't think I have to explain, right? Google it if you haven't seen a picture. But extremely muscular, riding around on a motorcycle, giant gun, leather clad. In the third Terminator movie, we get a female Terminator for the first time, or female coded. And these are actual cyborgs in the sense that they have flesh and to some degree blood, right? It's like described as like over like an endoskeleton that's synthetic. And in the third movie, the mean Terminator, there's always a good one and a mean one, right? Like the mean one in this case is this blonde woman who her first act when she arrives in present day, right, the present of the movie, after she's stolen somebody's like leather outfit, because she too needs leather. Apparently, she's driving away in this woman's car that she just stole, and she sees a billboard of lingerie. I think it's Victoria's Secret. And she looks at the billboard, notices that the breast size, the cup size of the model is larger than her own, and through sheer willpower increases her breast size. So that, like, her first act as Terminator is
really funny.
Yeah, right. And she goes around the entire movie, like, murdering, running around on high heels, right, tight leather, big breasts. So I think that's really interesting, because arguably the most famous cyborgs in the 80s are set up as extremely binary, right? So now we have the Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator fighting this woman Terminator, and we have exactly here. Well, there's no purity and innocence, but there certainly is, right, a very stereotypical kind of woman set up in opposition to the savior man in that narrative. And the reason I'm mentioning it here is because in a lot of the arguably, and I really think arguably, more feminist movies that follow a few decades later, and I'm thinking here, like you mentioned her, but I'm also thinking, for example, Ex Machina, right? We have like a tech bro in the woods who's developed a robot. It's a great movie. However, right, it is again, right, the robots that are center stage, they're robots, but they're beautiful women going around naked, of course. And then I guess the feminist twist is in the end that they murder the men, right?
Yeah.
But
I mean,
in the meantime, we've spent a whole movie looking at naked female bodies, right? Um, if you go to her, we have only a voice, right? In her, the Joaquin Phoenix character falls in love with his operating system, voiced by Scarlett Johansson, famously. And you might say like, oh, but now we've moved away from the whole, breast issue, right? Because no breast, because only a voice. However, it's Scarlett Johansson's voice, right? Who's, I think, elected like sexiest woman alive twice, right? And she has the husky, very particular kind of voice that, of course, evokes Scarlett Johansson.
yeah, you can't separate it.
It's sexiness in a voice, right? Like it's really hard to separate. And so, combine that with all the, I think, interesting commentary that came out, right? We already talked about the new ChatGPT iteration, right? Where some of the first criticisms were like, well, this is great, but why does it have to be so flirtatious? And why do the demos they show us, right? Like, of course, there was the whole kerfuffle that it sounded an awful lot like Scarlett Johansson, though she had not, of course, given them permission to use their voice. But they went for something very similar. Sam Altman tweeted her, connecting it very clearly to the movie. So there is this, what in the movie Her, what does Samantha, that's the name of the operating system, do? The first thing she does for the Joaquin Phoenix character is to sort through his mail, right? She's a secretary, right? Who then also flirts with him and sort of, comments on his jokes and laughs at his jokes. And so Cyborg's very broadly construed because, again, here we only have a voice, but I think, it's safe to include androids and just sort of artificial synthetic partners or love interests, sort of under this, in this category. We've gone in a very un-Harawayan direction, I think, right? If she was all about, okay, this is, well, she wouldn't use a term like post-gender or something, but she says that Cyborg has no truck with gender, no truck with binaries, no. And what we've seen is that these developments have taken us like further into the binary. If you look at these very popular movies, again, these very real technologies now at our disposal. So I do think that's interesting, but also if like before we said that it's the ambiguity that's if that's where the liberation lies and progress or whatever you want to call it. Of course, there's all sorts of niches. You just mentioned video games, right? And obviously, there's all sorts of AI partners you can set up in non-binary ways, etc. It's just that the dominant narratives are in a way very conservative, right, in these new technologies. And I think it's important to at least notice that, right, and read Haraway in that context, because then it's like, well, these are not the cyborgs. These are not the playful, ironic, rebellious creatures. These are more like Peggy and Mad Men, in the early seasons. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think even when there's sort of a revenge fantasy aspect to it, like an Ex Machina, it's still quite thinking in a binary, right? Rather than subverting or transcending or complicating.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, again, these are great movies, right? And very enjoyable. It's just that, it is interesting to see that the central figure Haraway proposed still reads as very radical today, whereas she had hoped that we were sort of embarking on a new age. And arguably, we've moved kind of backwards. We're closer to Rousseau than to Haraway.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it gets to to the degree, like, there's all sorts of ways to tell a story, and I think the sort of unwillingness, I think a lot of those stories are trying to kind of create the fear somewhere other than the uncanny that we've been talking about. You know what I mean? Like, in the sense of like, you could, I guess what I think what Haraway is doing, if I read her, if we read her as like celebrating the uncanny and like kind of taking pleasure in and enjoying and like embracing the uncanny, I think that's something that we still are unable to do. Like, we're still not doing that. And I think these stories that we're talking about, these movies, are kind of setting up, and they're still trying to they're relying on familiar kind of gender binaries to kind of tell another story, but they don't want to trouble that binary in the way that Haraway was.
Yeah, absolutely. Or if they do, then it's within very specific genres. And like you already mentioned, that you're kind of like clued into what genre you're dealing with right up front. And like Freud also says, like, well, a lot of the examples he uses come from fiction, because in fiction we're kind of ready to go along for the ride, but we know we can close the book, right, or pause the movie, and we can leave. Like to sort of to live it like would be an entirely different thing. And I think to an extent, I mean, for Haraway, it's also, of course, she's safely theorizing. It's quite but this is usually true of philosophers, right? Where
Yes,
it's
yeah.
always about paper. But even, like you point out, I think even in a lot of these movies, even within the fictional context, it's just like, okay, let's not go too far down that road. And of course, there are exceptions, but those tend to be those are not the big blockbusters, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, exactly. Well, we are nearing time. So is there anything that we didn't get to talk about or any lingering thoughts that you wanted to share that you were hoping to return to, or any work that you're excited to talk about, anything like that?
Well, there's this. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm really grateful to you that we could chat about this wide range of topics. One of the books that's sort of on my mind as we talk about this, and that just sort of like I already recommended Hoffmann, like very different author, and you've probably read her already, but Megan O'Giebelin wrote this great book. A God, Human, Animal, Machine. Have you seen this? Like,
No, I'm not familiar. Yeah, no, this.
yeah, so in kind of an undercurrent, we didn't explicitly touch on it. I mean, it came up, this notion of transhumanism, right? Like starting with Ray Kurzweil in the late '90s, and Giblin like came out with a few books, with a book a few years ago that talks about how this transhumanist movement, and especially this sort of Silicon Valley way of looking at the future, how it's uncannily, if I may, similar to kind of Christian salvation narratives. I mean, she grew up as a fundamentalist Christian, and kind of lost her faith, and then found transhumanism as a new faith before, and after a while realized, like, wait a second, I'm clinging to this because it actually gives me what I lost. But she says it's a new eschatology. Like, this is simply the same narrative presented as science. And so anyway, it's just something that was in my mind as we we're talking. It's a fantastic read. It's super, it's profound and accessible. And I really recommend it also in this context, because I think, there's also a really nice link to an affinity with Haraway's work, the way she like empathically skewers that whole transhumanist obsession with the singularity and all that. But in any case, that's just a loose thought.
No, that's a great recommendation. I bet listeners would like, and I'm definitely looking forward to that, and that's something that I'm very fascinated by too. And just to like square the circle on that a little bit, or just like wrap that up a little bit, is that I just think it is very fascinating, the kind of transcendence of the body that all of that kind of represents. And that's the thing that I really struggle with.
Yeah, yeah. Because that's not something Haraway would promote. She's not at all like, let's leave the body behind and upload our consciousness. Whereas, there seem to be a lot of people willing to just completely. It's like, no, we're spiritual machines, right? As Kurzweil would say, and that's to me deeply troubling.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's hard to let go of the fact that we are shaped by our bodies so much, and the body brain connection is so huge. I think people kind of maybe it's like a vulgar, like an oversimplified kind of vernacular we have for thinking about ourselves, and this sort of Cartesian dualism of like a separation of mind and body. But we know now that there's no such thing. So
right.
it's something weirdly unscientific.
Yes, exactly. And yet here's all these people having their brains frozen, like cryogenically, so that it actually happens, which it continues to amaze me. But yes, perhaps for a different time.
And we'll have to do a part 2. I'll have to do a second episode on all that. That would be a book club on that book. Well, I'm glad. And we didn't get to talk about the Book of Eels, but Now
Oh
I've
yeah, no, it was in the back of my mind. I didn't know where to deploy it
no.
because I think maybe the best way to contextualize Freud would actually be to say, well, first he tried with eels and he couldn't find the testicle, so I guess he went into psychoanalysis. I love that
Yeah.
chapter so much. It's so funny.
Yeah. I'm so
Just
glad you
cutting
liked
open
it.
eels day and night and comparing them to the women who also were elusive, elusive eels.
Yeah. No, it's incredible.
Yeah.
No, I'm glad you liked it. Yeah.
No, I've already recommended it to like several people. It's amazing. I had no idea about eels. I learned like, and I just reread the first chapter, just like what? Talk about an uncanny creature. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. That's what I thought was funny about it. But I think I think it's good we focused on the theory text. But I know we know in the back of our minds we were thinking about eels and Freud and
Yeah. The eels
eels.
were there. Subtext. The subtext was eels.
Yeah,
Uh,
great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Roos. I really love talking to you today.
no, thank you. This was so fun, and thank you for being like so engaged and so well prepared, and just
Oh, thanks.
wonderful way of setting up the questions. And it felt like a very natural conversation to me.
I feel like there's a lot of different insights from Roos that I want to summarize and reflect on here. We first started with the notion of the uncanny valley, Masahiro Mori's concept to describe how people were more comfortable with mechanistic-looking robotic prosthetics than those that looked more like but failed to perfectly replicate the appearance of actual human limbs. While Mori was writing in Japanese using the phrase bukimi no tani, Sigmund Freud also wrote a rather compelling and influential essay many years earlier on the uncanny in 1919, which in his native German was actually unheimlich. I hope that's good enough. That's the best German I can do. I was really struck by the fact that Heimlich, or the homely, from which unheimlich stems, has two very different meanings that ultimately capture the notion of the uncanny too. So, in being of the home, Heimlich can refer to familiar, cozy, comfortable, but also from another perspective, from the outsider's perspective, it is hidden, secret, and unfamiliar. The uncanny, then, as we discussed with Roos, refers to that which may or ought to be hidden becoming revealed. Unsurprisingly, Freud's argument about the uncanny was very much wrapped up in his distinctive and since very much reconsidered and critiqued, if still influential, notions of sexuality. He identified the uncanny in his male patients' reactions to female genitalia. For Freud, this reflected a human desire for wholeness, and it was the sense of the uncanny was a product of the repression that has rendered the womb, the original home, as strange, unfamiliar, or uncanny. Roos helped us question and critique the limits of Freud's understanding of the uncanny, that it was very gendered, heteronormative in certain ways. By returning to the story that Freud provided very limited reading of, that was ETA Hoffmann's The Sandman. In this story, the main character, Nathaniel, falls in love with an automaton named Olympia, and at the same time rejects his fiancée for being too rationalistic, reasonable, and intelligent, and not just taking his romantic sensibility at heart and uncritically. This automaton was a perfect blank slate, had no independent thoughts of her own, had none of that tricky pushback that his real fiancé had. And in that way, Nathaniel projects onto her his feelings, his understandings, and has this sense of being perfectly understood and communing with this automaton, who essentially, though, is not like a real person. There's nothing real about her. Roos helped us see how this is a trope that we see in our own media today. A great example is the movie Her, starring Joaquin Phoenix, where a lonely man going through a divorce falls in love with an AI assistant voiced by Scarlett Johansson. I think it's really useful to talk about these media and these representations because we see them pop up in our actual scientific discussions today. Seeing how OpenAI replicated and without credit or permission, Scarlett Johansson's voice in their AI assistant. To kind of give us a more critical perspective from which we could engage with the uncanny and not just see it as a source of fear or the product of maybe certain relations of domination and gendered expectations, Roos and I discussed Donna Haraway's 1985 Cyborg Manifesto. Whereas Freud's approach to the uncanny reified the gender binary, as well as other binaries like between the natural and the artificial, or the distinction between the individual and the human desire for total communion with others or a return to wholeness. Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto uses the figure of the cyborg to transcend, subvert, and transgress these same types of binary categories. The cyborg is a figure that describes how we ourselves as human beings are already inherently and drawn to using tools and technologies to extend ourselves, to supplement our capacities. So just like I use glasses or contacts, that represents a kind of cyborg identity. Just in the same way that I am recording these comments via my laptop and microphone. Also, I spend a lot of time thinking about what I want to say to you. And I think through that, not just by thinking in my own mind, but through writing these comments out and editing them. So I'm more than just natural. I'm not limited to my body, though I am shaped by my body and my physical capacities. But I'm creating and being created through artificial technology. The cyborg is distinct from the automaton in the Sandman. The cyborg is not a wholly artificial being. It is also not wholly unfamiliar, but a mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar. In other words, it is an uncanny figure. But Haraway pushes us to sit with and be willing to play with and maybe even find pleasure, not just fear or dread in the uncanny. This means not doing away with differences and distinctions, but subverting them and transgressing them and questioning them and going beyond them. It also means seeing ourselves in a networked, interdependent relationship, both with each other, with our communities, and with our technologies. One of the many things that can be frustrating about public discourse, at least in my view, about chatbots or large language models or artificial intelligence more broadly, is a lot of people treat these tools as though they are equal to or able to replace individuals, or even maybe whole swaths of services like mental health care, or even my own intellectual capacities for independent, critical thinking, rather than these being tools that we can work into and use to improve our pre-existing creative processes, just as we already use plenty of tools, articles, books, and even our conversations with each other to experiment with ideas, to think through things, reflect, and bounce off different ideas from each other. I think Haraway's approach allows us to avoid either perfectly idealizing or totally villainizing large language models and other technologies, and instead asks, how are these impacting our behavior? How do we respond to the rise of these tools, to the way that other people use them? Do they make us rethink what exactly we are doing when we are reading, writing, or interacting with each other, what the benefits are of education, and how to best ensure we all gain them? And she helps us question the assumptions that are persistently embedded in the development of technologies, like the repeated gendering of AI assistants in real life and in media representations, which often align femininity with servitude. Again, not just reaffirming this gender binary between femininity and masculinity, but also suggesting that life is a binary between submission and domination, meaning that for those who feel oppressed, that the only viable alternative is vengeful domination. This is a limited approach to our lives, to our politics, that we must move beyond. I'm recording this in mid-February, and reflecting on gender politics, I can't help but think about how since the inauguration and before, President Trump has turned to the kind of illiberal, personalistic, favor-based governance, typically befitting the courtly politics of an 18th century monarchy or a modern autocracy. And powerful men in the private sector are falling over themselves to please him and calling such methods of flattery and even rent-seeking masculine energy. Meanwhile, anyone who dares not to conform to the gender binary by being trans or non-binary, practices which, by the way, are not unique to our historical time or place, faces an even more oppressive state apparatus and healthcare environment. As Haraway concludes her essay, taking responsibility for the social relations of science and technology means refusing an anti-science metaphysics, a demonology of technology, and so means embracing the skillful task of reconstructing the boundaries of daily life in partial connection with others, in communication with all of our parts. To repeat a quote I mentioned talking to Roos, which is from my currently favorite video game, Baldur's Gate 3, though itself referencing Robert Frost's 1915 poem, A Servant of Servants. Sometimes the only way out is through. I think of respect for each other and each other's autonomy and the diversity of ways through which we jointly create our lives and relationships, using both our own capacities, our capacity for reason, our emotions, and our adoption of technologies, is the only way out of an increasingly anti-democratic and illiberal environment that many of us are facing right now in both the United States and elsewhere. If you enjoyed this conversation, I want to flag that we also talked about some of these issues with artificial life and 18th, 19th century thought with Eileen Hunt on her work on artificial life after Frankenstein back in season 1. And later this season, we'll have another episode with Eileen Hunt discussing romanticism and science fiction in her most recent book, The First Last Man, Mary Shelley and the Post-Apocalyptic Imagination. Thank you so much for joining us. Till next time.